Hello, this is Glenn Poole of the Monson Historical Society. The video that follows is the presentation of the Civil War musket that belonged to Harrison Davis. His descendants have presented it to us, and we are very fortunate to have it. Harrison lived in Elliottsville and Monson. We have a few stragglers here. My name is Glenn Poole, and I'm president of the Monson Historical Society, and we are greatly honored here to be honoring Civil War veteran Harrison Davis and the whole family. So we have, first thing we have, I think, is the Gettysburg Address by Jeffrey Pratt Russell.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out today. By point of reference, I am the great-grandson of Harry Davis, the Spruce Gum King. And I'm delighted to be here to read a poem that I used to stand next to Harry in the Memorial Square by the bandstand when he would recite on Memorial Day. I would ask that you listen carefully to the words beyond the familiar first refrain, as they are words of import. I am going to read them as they were originally written with no corrections for the modern day. Obviously, we have expanded our definition of who is included in the constitutional republic at this point. And I would ask that you reflect upon them and suggest to you that they are as equally relevant today as they were then, if not more so. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have members of the Sons of Union Veterans here from the local Sons of Union Veterans. So, and Wayne Bennett will, at the end, will receive the rifle on behalf of the Historical Society. But first, I think Ewan Farnham has a few things to say.
I thought it was okay. First of all, thank everybody for attending. I thought there'd be 3 or 4 people here. I'm quite overwhelmed with them. Of course, the family is here, and that's fairly big. But what I'm going to try to do is bring some context of why we're here, and the family and the members and so forth. And so I'm going to engage in that. It all starts in 1842 when Timothy and Susan Davis arrived in Elliottsville from Lebanon, New Hampshire via Parkman. And there were 5 children in the family, and the youngest and only daughter was born in Elliottsville. They purchased land in Elliottsville on the place where presently the Honeymoon Maple Works is located. They also purchased land a little further west called the Richard Davis Place. Recent owners of the Richard Davis Place was John Wakeman and Ruth Reeves. And the other property is still occupied by the Davis family. So there were 5 members in that family, and I'm interested in 3 of them. And it's because the 3 of them were in the Civil War. The first one was Harrison, which I'll get to later. Alden Davis was the middle son. He was in the Civil War and did not come home. He was a casualty, and he is buried in the National Cemetery in Culpeper, Virginia. And the third is Richard Davis. Harrison was my 3rd great grandfather. And I said I would come back to him, but I wanted to go through Richard just very quickly. Richard, and you'll get some of this military detail, was in the 1st Regiment of the Heavy Artillery, and he lived all his life in Elliottsville and was married to Josephine Sawyer, and they had 5 children. He died in 1922 at the age of 80. One of Richard's sons was Charles Davis, who also lived on the farm, and he married Blanche Stevens, and they had 3 children. One of Charles' children was Richard Leroy Davis, known locally as Roy. And he, for the most part, lived on the same land in his grandfather's place. He was married to Ruby Wyman and died in 1985. They had 2 children, one whom was Sylvia. Sylvia Davis married Lloyd Kelly, and one of their children was Rick Kelly, who lives in Monson and is in the 6th generation, and Rick is over there. And I said, I think that makes us 5th cousins. Now let me take Harrison Davis, because it did Richard and Alden. There was no history to him. So Harrison was drafted into the Civil War in 1864 and was at the surrender of Lee at Appomattox. He married Voda Corliss, and they lived on the family homestead, which was just up the road from the Richards place and where the sap works is now. And they had 3 children. And I'm going to talk about just one of the children. But Harrison, who was always very pleased to receive his government pension from the Civil War, lived until he was 95 years old, and died in about 1938, I think. So they had 3 children, and the prominent one was Harry Davis, and Harry Davis was a prominent citizen of Monson and was involved in many activities and gave the Gettysburg Address on Memorial Day in Monson, which Andrew has or Jeff has already cited. He was married to Bessie Hebbard, right out of Brooklyn, New York. And for the first years of their marriage, they lived in a log cabin that Harry had built on the homestead property. In 1911, they moved to Monson because they had 4 children and they needed more education than was offered in the one-room schoolhouses, and so they moved to Central Street to attend primarily schools. The 4 children, I'm just going to quickly go through. One was Lyman Davis. He worked at Central Maine Power Company, and he had an apple orchard at the Goodall Farm, which is also the same farm that Rick Kelly now occupies. Margaret, my mother, I'm going to come back to. Dorothy Davis Finley was married to Fred Finley. They lived their life in Monson. She had 2 children. They had 2 children, Dolly and Richard. And the 4th child was Betty Lou. She was a veteran of World War II, served in the Pacific, and she had a daughter, Luann Story. Back to Margaret Davis Farnham, because that's where we all come from. She married Rod Farnham in 1938, and our family had 5 siblings, and we were of the 5th generation. 4 of us are here today, and I would like to point them out. The oldest, Pat. And there's me. And then Jane. And Barbara. And I say Brother Alden, who is now 92, was not able to make it. I'm getting near the end. So now what I want to do, or we'll call it color guard after Andrew's speech. I'm going to introduce the color guard that is going to present the rifle to the sons of the Union veterans. So the only thing that I would add is that with 11 children in the 7th generation that are here, it won't be too long before there's an 8th generation. And if I don't get a chance to speak, I'd like to thank my niece Heather Briggs, who put this together. Also, Glenn Poole, who so graciously accepted the donation that we do, and also members of the veterans.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. My name is Andrew Davis Russell. I'm Ewan's nephew. I'm Margaret's grandson. Harry Davis, the Spruce Gum King's great-grandson, and Harrison Davis's great-great-grandson. It's been my honor for the last 30 years or so to actually be the keeper of his musket. It's been in our living room. I think it was about a year ago I mentioned to you, and I've got that musket. Maybe it should be in the Historical Society. This all came about, so really very pleased to be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about Harrison's Civil War service and the musket as we know it. Not much is known about Harrison's service in the Civil War. We have his service dates, his name's on the regimental muster rolls. We can track the service of his regiment during the time when he was there. But unfortunately, any of the personal anecdotes, day-to-day life, those stories are lost to history. Fortunately, our grandmother was a bit of a historian herself and captured everything she could, but we still don't really know what his day-to-day was like. We know he was a private in Company E of the 11th Maine Regiment. The regiment was formed in Augusta, Maine in 1861. It saw service in the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. The regiment participated in the siege of Yorktown and the bloody battles of Williamsburg, Fair Oaks, and Malvern Hill in May of June of that year. In the summer of 1863, the regiment was in Charleston. If anybody saw the movie Glory, there was a unit of the regiment, an artillery detachment, that participated in the siege of Battery Wagner, which was made famous in that film. Harrison's story began, as you had mentioned, on October 1st, 1864, when he was drafted into the 11th Maine. He was 27. He was single at the time, and he was following in the footsteps of his brothers Alden and Richard. Both Alden and Richard served in the 3rd Maine Regiment. Richard started in an artillery battery when he transferred to the 3rd Maine to be closer to his brother. Alden was drafted in 1863, and he died from wounds and sickness. As Ewan mentioned, he's buried in the Culpeper Cemetery. Richard enlisted in December 1863, but he managed to reach Alden in the hospital before he died. When Harrison was drafted, his draft papers described him as standing 5 feet 4 inches in height, with blue eyes and brown hair, and his occupation was listed as a farmer. As I mentioned, we know very little about his day-to-day activities in the Union Army, but we do know what was happening when he joined the Army of the Potomac. When Harrison entered, the war had started a new phase. No longer were the armies fighting battles only to retreat and face each other another day. Instead, it had taken on a more ominous character in the trenches around Petersburg, Virginia. Men fought each other from behind fixed positions and made heavy use of artillery, mines, and mortars. It was a precursor to the type of warfare that would devastate Europe nearly 50 years later in the First World War. And this is what was going on when Harrison entered the 11th Maine in the trenches at Petersburg. From the fall of 1864 until early April 1865, he was with the unit, with the regiment, in and around the trenches of Petersburg and Bermuda 100, where the Grant supply line started. And he was there when Lee's line was broken and his Army of Northern Virginia was chased to Appomattox. Harrison, along with this musket, was present at Appomattox Courthouse on the day Lee surrendered. It's always kind of struck me where that musket has been. What he witnessed that day can only be surmised today. I would love to have the stories that he could have told us. After the war, he returned to Elliottsville. He married and raised 3 children, including his son Harry. As I mentioned, he became the Spruce Gum King of Maine and was my grandmother's father. Harrison seldom left his farm. Perhaps he had seen enough of the world in his youth. He lived to the ripe old age of 95, dying in 1932. I'm proud to say our Uncle Alden is the last living link of our family to Harrison. He was an infant when Harrison was still alive, and there's a picture of my grandmother holding him next to her father, and Harrison with his long gray beard to her right. So it's amazing to think that there's still a member of this family connected to a Civil War veteran. Most of Harrison's possessions were lost in a fire in Elliottsville in the 1950s. Fortunately, however, the musket survived, and it's remained a treasured part of our family history for generations. It's a .58 caliber service musket of the type that was issued to thousands of soldiers at that time. It's dated 1863 and it was manufactured by Colt in Hartford, Connecticut. At some point in the last 150 years or so, the ramrod was lost and somebody hand-carved a wooden barrel stopper. Might have been Harrison himself. One has only to lift the musket and feel the bayonet to get a sense of the immense power of this weapon and the role it played in the battles of that era. I've been honored to be the musket's keeper for the last 3 decades, and on behalf of the Farnham Davis family, it's with great pride that I get to be here today to present it to the Monson Historical Society on behalf of Harrison Davis and all his descendants, and as a physical reminder for future generations of the sacrifices our ancestors made to preserve the Union and end slavery.
So we're ready for the presentation? Okay. I have 4 or 5 presenters, if they will come up here in the front. Shoulder.
You're one too. Do we need to be in age order, generation order? I don't know. Are we presenting it to them? Are we presenting it to the son?
Next to me, James. And Susan.
Mary Davis is great.
Then Heather.
Granddaughters that just stood up.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right
And
there.
Nathan? Yeah. Gabriel, okay. I want to just quickly go through this because it was kind of, how do we line up and who's going to be the color guard and so forth. Okay. I got preference, so I'm in there. The next is Margaret Jane Farnham Rabini. She's 5th generation, and she's been involved in the maple operation. Excuse me. Her daughter, who's here, owns property on Monson Pond. So I make a connection to Monson. Next is Susan Catherine Sprague Landon. She's 5th generation, and she owns the family cottage along with her sister on Monson Pond. Then follow with Heather Marion Briggs Mackey. She's the one that put this together. Now we're into the 6th generation, and she visits frequently Monson Pond with her parents, Barbara and Bob Briggs. Finally, I'm coming to Nathan, who is in the 7th generation, and it's Nathan William Farnham. And his connection in, he's a member of the Ellisville Snowmobile Riders Snowmobile Club. And then Gabriel Davis Willett, again 7th generation, and his parents own the campground which we occupy on Monson Pond. So now that we know the presenters, I guess if you just stand behind and turn around, and Gabe, you're the youngest, so you're going to hand the rifle to the sons of the Union.
Present arms. Shoulder, arms. May I just mention something? I didn't realize it till we were here, but we are members of Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, but there's a uniform ceremonial branch which we also belong to, which is the Sons of Veterans Reserve, of which we are all members. We're the only Sons of Veterans Reserve unit in Maine. Our unit designation is Company F, 11th Maine Volunteer Infantry.
Thank you. Now we'll have them march that over to the museum, and it'll be on display upstairs on the Civil War area of our museum. And if you get a chance to go over, you'll also see a display of the spruce gum operations, a little video display of the spruce gum operations over there too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much
Glenn.